Well, hey there, and welcome back to the show. I'm so glad that you're here and that you get to have a front row seat to my unfiltered conversation with Drea Elzy. And this is part 2 of our interview because there was so much rich detail and we had so much to talk about that I split it into 2 parts, which I think is probably a dream in the making for Drea Elzy. So she's probably somewhere just thanking all the goddesses right now, and all those higher beings for it being split into 2, because I think ultimately that was her goal. Am I right, Drea? Are you listening to this right now? So in our conversation, you get a particular trip inside of her mind, which is a wildly brilliant mind, I must say. And you're being invited to listen to Drea and I just kind of bouncing ideas off of one another like 2 old friends catching up. And so, you know, here's your front row seat, and we provide more questions than we do answers. So look forward to that. You're welcome. We giggle, we ponder, and we dive deeply into lessons and guidance from both her personal and her professional journeys in this wild, wild environment we call K-12 and higher education environments. Now, we conclude our episode, our conversation, with information about how to connect with Drea. How do you add her to your network? And that information comes at the end of the episode. And it's kind of funny. So I want you to give me a little leeway here at the end of the episode, because in the editing decisions that we made about this episode, I wanted to keep it as unfiltered as possible without messing with the integrity of the sound and without interrupting your listener experience too much. But I tried to close out the episode a couple of times, and Drea had her own thoughts about how we needed to close the episode, and she was just really excited. She brought a lot of energy, and, you know, so it was like 2 good friends just trying to stay on the call with each other forever. And she was not really having it. She was not trying to close out our conversation. So, you know, and I was blushing because she was trying to compliment me, and I don't take compliments very well. So you get firsthand experience there by listening in on the episode. On a technical note, the sound quality was not the best, and I'm not going to say which video conference software I used, but it is not the one I usually use, which is Zoom. I love Zoom, but it wasn't Zoom. And so I decided to keep the file and hope that, you know, Dustin Ramsdell, who edits many of my podcast episodes, could work his magic to enhance the quality of it, because Drea provided some really amazing points and knowledge and questions and just streams of linear and spiral thought that I really thought that you'd enjoy and get a lot from. So we didn't redo the interview. We just kept it as is. And I hope that you enjoy it. And so towards the end, Drea and I have even a technical moment that I decided to keep in the spirit of providing these unfiltered spaces that Drea mentions, because she seems to flow really seamlessly back into her stream of thought. And although it was super hilarious, it does give you insight into some of the blunders that might happen when we're interviewing a podcast. There might be dogs barking in the background. There's train noises. There's, you know, all sorts of the outside world trying to bombard our time that we have allocated for the podcast. So, you know, I hope that behind the scenes knowledge is fun for you to know and helps you to manage your expectations at the very end of the episode. Some of the moments that we let you have experience with us. So thank you so much for listening into this episode. I will get out of your way for now, but I'm really appreciative and grateful for all your support. Welcome to the Resilient Campus Podcast, amplifying the voices of college inclusion innovators. I'm your host, Sabby Labor, founder and CEO of Resilient Campus. Join me each week as I interview professionals on the front lines of campus and community movement building. For more information, please visit resilientcampus.com/podcast. Well, Andrea, you gave us a little insight into kind of what goes on in your mind all day, every day. Give us some of those resources that are informing the way that you think and the way that you approach your work. What are those books, those podcasts, those authors or scholars, like what does that list look like for you?
I mean, I think of, the Sean Harpers of the world. I think, I obviously think of Resilient Campus. I love your podcast.
Thanks.
I think of a lot of departmental work. So for me, I immediately kind of hinge on, yes, I can go to the literature and I can go to theory, but for me, I really hinge on high impact practices. So I'm really looking at like HIPs across the nation. So like, what are, the community college districts, for example, if I'm looking at wanting to implement something at city colleges, what is, Virginia doing, West Virginia with their community college, system, for example. What is Los Angeles doing to implement similar or aligned programs that might be something that, looks at a similar effort. And so I think for me, I look at the national work. So like, what comes to mind obviously is like USC Race and Equity Center. Like I think about the great work that they're doing there. So like, I'm always kind of like, oh, I'm on all these listservs for everything. What's interesting is that LinkedIn has become like a new, really amazing resource for me because I'm loving that anybody can publish. Like you can just publish like your own thread and it just goes viral. And I find that, yes, while it's really important that we are in tune with and that we are connected to bodies of literature that are written by our scholars and our, people that have been publishing for years, I also think it's important that we're just looking at stories. And I think about what you kind of helped me to inform this frame a bit for me, Sabby, when you came to City Colleges to Write College for Equity Symposium, and you did your piece on Brown, and you were really talking about storytelling. So like anybody can tell their story. But what I'm finding out is that some of these stories, I mean, when you tell us, we all know data tells us a story. But when you're able to give us a qualitative perspective, it doesn't just tell us the story necessarily, it also it gives us a full picture around impact as well. And so for me, I find that I get so much out of just seeing just kind of like my community's posts and the things that are kind of going viral in my professional communities and all of my connections across the LinkedIn world, because it doesn't have to be a scholarly piece to inform the way that I do my work. It could simply be a story around, and I'll give you an example. One of my post-secondary navigators, shout out to Alana Mbanza, she chaperoned 3 to 4 students from one of her high schools that she actively works out of to Paul Quinn in Texas. These students didn't have cell phones. They didn't have luggage. They had a one-way ticket. Didn't have, the basic needs like, multiple changes of clothes, like laundry detergent. So she actively went to Texas to help these students, to take them to the JCPenney locker, locker for basic needs, goods that they would need, clothing. To me, I can't give you a number and capture that impact. I need the story. And so I feel like things that have been really community-based for me lately have been really powerful. So yes, I love the literature and I love, and again, I'll reference Sean Harper because I think the work that he's doing is just, I think prolific in terms of folks who we see doing amazing work right now in real time. But even beyond that, just the stories of the practitioners that I'm connecting with. And even things on Facebook. I'm a part of these groups that are millennials and student affairs. And women of color in academia. There's this group called Binders. It's Binders, a woman, a group for women in academia. And it's women just sharing their stories just around here's my experience working with this and working with that. And then people kind of chime in and talk about have you thought about this way? Have you thought? So I think social media has obviously created this whole new way to communicate, but I think even professionally to think about how can we take some of the feedback that we're receiving from our counterparts across the country and look at that as a possible actionable thing that you can bring back then to your community or to your campus. And so it doesn't have to be a piece of scholarly work. It could just be something that, oh my God, that might work for me. Or that's very pointed or that's very drilled to something specific that you're doing. So I found a lot of just a lot of use and kind of a lot of joy, actually, too, and just kind of finding these little communities, but also reading the stories. And I give you, like, a lot of props on that, Sabby, in terms of your work around the storytelling piece, because I don't think, and you said this when you came out to Rec College, but I don't think we talk about that enough. And I don't mention this to say, because those of you who are doing qualitative research, yes, you're thinking about your story. But I think a lot of our work sometimes is metrics driven in terms of a number, particularly if you're working in enrollment, if you're working in spaces that are like, we need numbers. And that can be difficult. But I think thinking about and figuring out how to create stories is so important. And so I thank you for bringing that narrative to the forefront, because it really made me reflect on the work that I do as well.
Well, and as you were talking, it actually, I was generating a new thought or way that I'm thinking about stories as you're describing them, like the richness of which you're giving value to them. I appreciate that, because I do think we need to elevate them, like you're saying, and really know how to move them to the next phase of, okay, well, what do we do with this story now? And one thing I thought, Drea, when you were talking was, sometimes, like, I'm overwhelmed. Like, if I go out to, if it's like a beautiful night outside, and out here, you know, as opposed to LA, we can't see the stars very much, but out here we can see the stars, right? Like, if there's a clear sky, it's like beautiful, and sometimes I'm overwhelmed, like, wow, if I were to take a picture right now, it wouldn't even describe like 10% of the feeling of gratitude and like smallness that I feel in this open sky right now. And like, you can't, it's right. Such a visceral experience. You can't describe it to someone to the full extent. You can only get like part of that tremendous impact through a story. So it's like, if we elevate stories to where we understand that, wow, if this narrative, if this story that a student is telling us or a colleague is telling us is only, 10% of the true impact that it had, whether that's positive or negative, I think we can even get closer to understanding that we really do need to figure out how to integrate those into the learnings and the learning culture of institutions, right? So I appreciated that you helped me arrive there.
Yeah, and I think, thank you, and same to you. I think, I think this is not new to program or anyone who does programming. Like, how do you capture a successful program? It's not, and we always talked about this in Res Ed. If one student walks through the door, it's a success, right? So it's like, even though we would be like, womp womp, but it's like one of those things, like, how do you measure truly in a way, and we know this through, our methodologies and the way that we know how to tackle literature and how to just capture data, but through a story, and going back to what you mentioned, making that actionable, making that something that you can then go back and say, oh, okay, this happened. Based on this story, how do I kind of process that in a backwards way that's now going to sort of inform the next time that happens? I mean, obviously we know it's like learning by doing, right? Like, hey, that didn't work. Let me try it this way. But I think the story piece is critical there. Like, we have to have some kind of story and a way to capture that in the right way. And I think for us, our struggle is learning and figuring out, again, how to capture that impact. Because I can report out all the numbers of students that we've served, but it doesn't fully, like, I even struggle with that some days, because I'm like, it doesn't fully capture what I want it to capture. Like, I can tell you our metrics, I can tell you how many students we served, I can tell you the type of service they were given, I can run you through their individual learning plans, I can tell you the 3 scholarships that they applied for, I can tell you their match and their fit, because we've gone through that with them. But when we talk about what I just described about Paul Quinn, how do I get there in terms of capturing that in a way that is traditionally, I think, accepted as like an anecdotal, like, piece of evidence? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we are always looking at like the metric, and tell me the story based on the metric. It's like, well, can I just tell you the story? And so I think I find value in that.
Well, and what you make me think of is that higher ed has had this contention over the years about adapting to the various like holistic needs of students in their everyday lives as we kind of extend out, like, what is our role in serving students? Is it, that we provide food shelves and support for students who are encountering housing insecurity and homelessness, etc. Right? So it's like we're almost struggling with this expanding role from an institutional standpoint, and those metrics are a little outdated, right? They're back to when we thought that our role in loco parentis was only to, kind of have this very limited support role for students that was, only faculty and student interaction. And then student affairs was developed, right? And so I don't know, just in thinking about how higher ed has developed over the years and how we haven't really evolved in how we assess that holistic impact, like you were saying with the trip to Texas with these students, like that is transformative in terms of like there's not metrics that can capture that if we're not evolving with.
And that's a problem. Yeah. Oh, I'm like, yes, you're right. I mean, how do we transform the traditional methodology that we know? Like, how do we go back to, I mean, I guess you can't, I mean, it would be telling people, okay, well, this is not the way to write a dissertation anymore. But people aren't writing dissertations in the same way anymore. I mean, you have people writing like rap lyrics, you know what I mean? You have people doing things that are like doing films. You have people that are attacking their methodologies in such different ways. And I think I wonder the ways in which stories are implementing a story framework or a qualitative framework that doesn't rely on a metric, but that relies on, I think, really like an impact measure. And I don't really even know what that would look. I mean, maybe we're creating something new right here, just in this synergy in this moment. But I agree with you, because I think that is always my challenge, is thinking about my numbers are fine, but I want to go beyond that. I want to go to like the finite of the experience. Like, what is the student, like, I want to get into the head of the student. Like, what is the student thinking? Like, what is their experience? How have they come to that conclusion? Like, if you know what I mean, I want to know all of it. And so for me, I think about the way that we traditionally know how to gather data, the way that we have gathered data, the way that we do research. I don't know. I think the story piece again, and I don't want to belabor the point, but it just resonates with me because I feel like there's such a value to a shift in paradigm when we think about the way that we report out impact. And I think that paradigm shift maybe is needed, to your point.
I think what listeners can count on from Drea and myself is that we'll leave you with a lot of questions to consider, and we look for you to help us fill in some of these gaps in terms of like, yeah, you be the ones to help answer some of these questions. We look forward to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we may need a part 2. I don't know. I think, there's a whole lot, I think, to kind of capture just one last point. I think there's a whole lot of work. And we say this all the time in higher ed student affairs, and even in just in education, there's a whole lot of work to be done. But I think it's worth the question of what work is really priority when we think about and we put students at the center of this work. And I think measurement is so critical, and thinking about impact is so critical, and thinking about equity is so critical. I know we didn't even get into Learn, Plan, Succeed and equity, because I've gotten a lot of questions from people on the West Coast about like, how about Learn, Plan, Succeed, and how are you thinking about equity? And I'm like, it's not my initiative, it's the mayor's initiative. I mean, I have thoughts about it. That's a whole separate podcast. But, all of these things, I think are important to think about when we think about the way in which we best posture ourselves to do this work. And I think for me, I'm consistently thinking about how to shift my paradigm, how to really kind of flip, for all intents and purposes, like the ceiling to the floor. Because I've found that thinking in that way, in many ways, creates strategies for me strategies for me that create environments and create levels of thinking that then allow me to be solution focused. And so I think that's just helpful.
That's great, Drea. And just a technical note, you sound like really far away from the phone. Did you move at all, or did it just change?
Hold on, let me look. Oh, one of my earbuds fell out. Is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I apologize.
That's okay.
I got all fired up and one of my earbuds fell out.
Those earbuds cannot handle you.
This is what happens on the Resilient Campus podcast. You get all fired up and your earbuds fall out.
We need shock resistant.
Gabby gets me all crazy. No, I would love to come back and do a part 2. I mean, this has been so great. I think very ethereal. And this is the thing about me and Sabby is like, you get us together and we're going to think not just about what we're doing. It's going to go like to a whole other place.
It's going to spiral out of control.
But I think but I appreciate the reflection, and I think it's so important. And it's important to have these thought partnerships and these sort of, not unfiltered fully spaces because it's going out to the world, but like these unfiltered spaces to a degree where you can feel just like you can be you and really just talk about what's on your mind, in terms of the field and the work. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you and the invitation to just chat.
Yeah.
I felt like it was awesome.
I'm excited, Drea, and we're going to switch gears a little bit, and maybe you won't be such a big fan of mine when I ask you these last 2 questions, but I'm hoping that we can get through it. So take us through one of the biggest lessons that you've learned in your professional life, and take us through those moments, and then what is some guidance that you would give folks that are doing this work today?
I think probably 2 things, and I'm going to try and be as succinct as possible. I think the first one is sort of, and I'm just going to posture this in this way, is like knowing when. I think for me, like, I feel like, as I mentioned, like my thought process is very rapid, but I also tend to kind of act quickly as well. Because when you see challenges and you see students in spaces where you want to fix that problem, or you want to be a support and you want to be an advocate, and you really want to be that true problem solver because you want the student to be successful, our first instinct is to react, fix the problem, get it done. And while I'm like, if you're in res ed, yes, that's critical. I think in spaces where you're thinking about strategy, or you're thinking about programmatic resiliency, where you're thinking about things that you really want to tease out and you really want the fullest intentionality out of your own thinking and your own process, kind of like take that step back for a second and really allow yourself to, and I always kind of use this metaphor, like, you can be at the top of the mountain and it's okay to climb back down and to kind of like figure out a different way to get back up. Like take like a 1 mile walk to the right and then climb back up, and it's going to be a completely different experience. And so I like it, and the reason why I use that sort of analogy is I liken that to kind of like our ways of thinking sometimes. Sometimes we're like, oh, this has been successful, we're going to do this, let's go, let's act, boom, we know how to solve this problem. I oftentimes, when I engage with my staff, say, think about how you might, although you were successful, think about how you may approach what you just did or what you tackled differently. And I say that to say it doesn't put down the way that you did it because you were successful and it was great and you feel good about it and your students got something amazing out of it. But there are different ways that we can challenge ourselves. And I think that's one of them. So I'll say that's my first. Challenge yourself. Don't be afraid to be at the top of the mountain and climb back down. Take a mile walk to the right, climb back up. Because you may have been at the top, but the other side of that mountain was very different. And there's many learning lessons involved in that. I would say the second is be very prepared for rejection. And I say that because I think that this can be a very challenging field. I once had a mentor, shout out to Leslie Brenner, out in Rhode Island, in the Isle of Rogue, she says, who once said, academia and or student affairs and our working in education will leave you for dead. and I don't say that because I love this world. I love this profession. That's my passion, my purpose. So I don't say that to demean this field. I say that to say it's a very challenging field to be a part of. And I remember when I moved to Chicago, like I was filling out like job application after application after application after application. I was just like, why is nobody Like, why can't I find something that like is going to stick for me? And it was a very frustrating moment in time because I knew I had the skill set. I knew, and even frankly, like, and this is real. I knew I had the social like capital from like USC, and I'd been to a great school, and I was like, what is going on? And I realized, like, wow, this ecosystem doesn't trust me yet. Right? This place doesn't quite trust me yet because I haven't found my footing. And so I say that to say, to go back, there's always going to be, I think, a time in this field, and this is, and I'll speak for myself, but I'll also sort of tease out feedback I've gotten from my colleagues as well. Is like, there's always a moment in time where you kind of feel stuck, or you feel like, well, why isn't that job offered? And I think too, like, depending on where you are, it could be a bit of a saturated field. I know in California, my counterparts have expressed that, and colleagues and friends have expressed that as well, who work in this field. So I would just say, like, be prepared for those challenges, but find things outside of the 9 to 5 that allow you the connection to students. So when I wasn't fully employed and when I was in my space of like what's going on, I'm new to Chicago, I get it. They don't really trust me yet. They don't really think I get, the landscape. They don't think I get the students in the community. I get that it's like a very special sort of club. It really is kind of like feels like a club to be a part of sometimes. But at the same time, I sit where I sit now. So I think for me, it was a learning lesson around be open to people not immediately recognizing your value. And I don't mean be open to that as not recognize your own value. I mean, be aware that there will be people that do not. And find your ways to be attached to students outside of that. So I was doing consultation, and that was my way that I was getting like my soul filled. Because I was engaging with students, and it was like, oh my God, this is why I do what I do. And we all kind of have to sometimes remind ourselves of that moment of like, oh my God, this is why I do what I do. Right? So find that moment, and that's like my second point. But like find that moment or that space for you. Even if that's like volunteering, even if that's, finding a community, CBO, community business organization that does great work with students. Keep that connection alive. And I think that would be two of my biggest pieces of advice that I think are more like kind of on the personal, motivation space. But I think also when to move, like that first point, I would also add to that and say, and I'm sorry to be a little bit disjointed right now, sadly. I would also say in your professional space, know when to move. Because I think too, when you start to have access and entree and have those ears that I was talking about, not just a seat at the table, but those ears, it's about knowing when to introduce and knowing when to bring forth a new idea or something that's innovative or something that's dynamic. And frankly, knowing the people who are going to support that as well. So when I say knowing when, it's like knowing at the same time, like who. I know that was slightly disjointed, so I apologize.
I think I can resonate with how you're arriving to some of those points because that's how my brain weaves this magical path to drawing some connections. So I really appreciate you working that through.
Apologies to the audience because, I think it's sometimes like I think particularly this experience, but when you're reflecting on your own experiences, you then come upon additional reflection, which is like reflection on reflection upon reflection. And so like reflection. So I think, these questions are really great and I appreciate them. So thank you.
Thank you, Drea. And so, we're connected and I'm so grateful for that, but how can other folks that want to add you to the network, how can they do that? What's the best way?
Yeah, you can catch me on LinkedIn. I'm under Andrea Elzy. I think you could find me under Drea Elzy as well. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram, Drea. I also have an Instagram for just kind of like a fun side thing for outreach for student affairs professionals. This is Student Affairs. So you can follow us on Instagram, and Sabby, like, I'll send you a little blast, and you can maybe blast the Instagram page. That would be awesome. My email, please do, like, if you're somebody who just wants to reach out, I'm happy to chat with any one of your listeners out there in the universe. But my email is aelzy1@ccc.edu. If you Google post-secondary navigation, City Colleges of Chicago, you'll likely find my name pop right up. Please reach out. I'm thrilled to have been a part of, just what you're doing, Sabby. Honestly, it's awesome, and I think it's just a great vehicle for people to, I think, come together and find that community, but also kind of just, again, talk through everything. Not just talk to the personal, not just the professional, but the personal, and just kind of be a little bit, allow that space to be a little bit reflective and ethereal. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Drea. I mean, I always look forward to just connecting with you and on a personal basis, and I am just so grateful for what you offered our listeners today.
Sabby, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure. I'm looking forward to a round 2. So please let me know. We can, when we can make that happen. And I'm more than happy. Please do let me know how I can connect people, and I will continue to connect people to Resilient Campus as well, and all of your podcasts and resources. And thank you for everything that you do, for real, honestly.
You're awesome, Drea. Thank you. So I wanted to close out with an aspirational quote to send all the listeners back out into the world. And thank you to Drea for providing this quote for today. I love that it came from our Inspiration Monday as well. That was a really beautiful connection. This quote comes from Asada Shakur. Dream and reality are opposites. Action synthesizes them. To all those listening in, thank you so much for all that you do. I truly appreciate you. Stay resilient. Thanks so much for tuning in. Head on over to iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on a single episode.